You won't believe what happened the night my boss asked me to stay late in the office. I know it sounds like one of those stories you read in the back pages of a magazine, but trust me, this one is real, and it changed me in ways I didn't see coming. Before I get into it, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? I always imagine someone in New York, or maybe a gentleman sitting in his favorite chair in Dallas, or even someone all the way out in Seattle listening in with a cup of tea. Tell me your city in the comments, because it makes me feel like I'm sharing these memories with friends across the country. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe and give this story a like. It helps more people hear it. And honestly, it feels like you're keeping me company while I tell it. Now, let me take you back to that night. I was 55, though I'll admit some mornings I felt closer to 70 after staring at spreadsheets and emails for 12 hours straight. My office was on the 15th floor of a tall glass building downtown, the kind where the windows turned black at night and reflected your face back at you like a mirror. I'd been there longer than most people in my department, 15 years of steady work, mentoring new hires, and covering late shifts when deadlines loomed. I wasn't flashy, but I was dependable, and sometimes I wondered if that was why my boss, Richard, relied on me so much. Richard was one of those men who seemed to carry calm in his pocket like spare change. He was in his early 60s, tall, silver hair that somehow looked deliberate instead of neglected, and a voice that softened the edges of every word. He wasn't just my boss. Over time, he'd become someone I trusted. He listened when no one else did, and he had this way of making me feel like my work wasn't invisible. That evening, when most of the office lights had gone out and the hum of copy machines had died, I heard his footsteps behind me. "Margaret," he said softly, as though he didn't want to startle me. "Could you stay a little longer? There's something we need to finish." I remember pausing, my hands hovering over my keyboard. I was tired, yes, but also curious. There was something in his tone, a gentleness, almost a vulnerability, that I wasn't used to hearing from him. I nodded, and he smiled, that small, grateful smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The office after hours felt like another world. The carpet muffled our steps, and the only light came from the glow of desk lamps and the city outside, a grid of golden squares flickering against the black sky. I could see our reflections in the windows as we worked side by side, the rest of the floor eerily quiet. It struck me then how rare it was to share silence with someone comfortably, to not feel rushed or awkward. He asked me about my day, not the polite kind of question you throw out, but the kind where he leaned back in his chair and actually waited for my answer. I found myself telling him more than I'd intended, about how I'd been missing my late husband more lately, how the house felt too big and too quiet at night, how sometimes I wondered if my best years were behind me. Richard didn't interrupt. He didn't brush past my words. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something like tenderness. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, "you carry so much, and you never let it show. But you're not invisible to me." For a moment, I couldn't speak. No one had said something like that to me in so long. I stared down at the papers between us, pretending to read, but really I was steadying myself against the warmth that rose in my chest. We went back to work, but the air between us had shifted. Every time our hands brushed as we reached for the same file, I felt it. Every time he leaned closer to point out a number on the page, his cologne, clean, understated, seemed to wrap around me. I told myself it was just the lateness of the hour, the intimacy of an empty office, but deep down I knew it was more. The clock on the wall ticked past 9, then 10. The city lights dimmed as the streets grew quieter. Richard finally pushed back from his desk and sighed. "We've done enough for tonight," he said, his tone carrying both weariness and relief. He stood, stretching, and I noticed how the light caught in his hair, how time had carved dignity rather than weakness into his features. He walked me to the elevator, though he didn't need to. That's when it happened, the moment that still makes my heart race when I think about it. We stood there waiting, the silence deep and heavy, and he looked at me, not as a boss, not as a colleague, but as a man seeing a woman. His gaze lingered, gentle yet steady, and I felt something stir inside me I thought I'd lost. "Margaret," he said again, but this time my name carried weight, like a confession. I swallowed hard, my palms damp. Yes. His lips parted as if he might say more, but just then the elevator chimed. The doors opened, and the spell broke. We stepped inside together, side by side, shoulders almost touching. I don't know if it was the quiet hum of the elevator descending or the way the dim light softened his face, but in that moment I realized how fragile and precious connections can be, even when they come unexpectedly. When the doors opened to the lobby, he placed a hand gently on my arm. Not firm, not demanding, just a touch that said, "I see you." And for the first time in years, I felt seen. That night, as I drove home through the empty streets, I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my mind. The way he listened, the way his hand lingered on my arm, the way the silence between us felt less like absence and more like possibility. I told myself it was nothing, just a late night at work. But deep down, I knew it was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. And that's where it started, the night my boss asked me to stay late, and nothing in my life was quite the same after. The funny thing about memories is that they follow you like shadows. All the next day, as I tried to answer emails and update reports, I couldn't stop thinking about the quiet hush of the office the night before. Every time I glanced at the elevator doors, I remembered the way Richard's hand had rested on my arm, so light, so careful, as if he were afraid I might vanish if he held on too tightly. I told myself it was nothing, just kindness, just a boss showing gratitude. But there was something else too, something I hadn't felt in years, a stirring, a kind of electricity that hummed beneath the surface of my otherwise ordinary day. I caught myself touching my own arm where his fingers had been, as though the memory of his warmth could still be found there. That evening I stayed later than usual, though this time he hadn't asked me to. I busied myself with files, pretending it was necessity, but the truth was, I wanted to feel that quiet again, that strange intimacy that only came after the building emptied and the city softened into night. Around 7, I heard his office door open. His footsteps were unhurried, and when he appeared in the doorway of my cubicle, his face broke into that small, tired smile. "Still here, Margaret." I laughed lightly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. I suppose old habits die hard. I like finishing what I start. He stepped closer, leaning against the edge of my desk. His presence was never overwhelming. He didn't crowd me, but I could feel it all the same. "That's what I admire about you," he said, his voice softer than the hum of the air conditioner. "You give more than anyone notices, more than anyone deserves, maybe." Those words sank into me, deeper than I wanted to admit. My heart quickened, and I looked down at the papers in front of me to steady myself. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter, like I'm just one cog in a wheel. Richard shook his head slowly. "No, Margaret, you matter. You matter more than you know." It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Gentle, certain, as though he were telling me something he'd been holding back. For a moment, our eyes locked, and the silence stretched. My breath caught in my chest. I shifted, breaking the gaze, afraid of what he might see in my face. "So," I said, my voice a little unsteady, "what's keeping you here so late tonight?" He chuckled, running a hand through his silver hair. Avoiding the empty house, if I'm honest. Work gives me an excuse not to sit alone in silence. The honesty in his tone made me ache. I knew that feeling, the echo of an empty room, the weight of solitude. It was strange how alike we were in that moment. Both of us carrying lives that looked full on the outside, but quietly lonely underneath. We ended up in his office, not because there was work to be done, but because neither of us seemed ready to go home. The city outside glittered through the wide glass windows, a sea of lights stretching endlessly into the dark. He poured us both coffee, though it was late, and we sat across from each other like two people who had all the time in the world. We talked about things I'd never shared with anyone at work. My late husband's laugh, the garden I tended behind my house, the way I sometimes stood in the kitchen late at night, staring at old photographs. He told me about his grown children, how he missed the chaos of having them under one roof, how the silence of his apartment sometimes pressed in on him. There was no rush, no awkwardness, just two voices weaving stories into the stillness, and beneath it all, that quiet hum again, that fragile awareness of something unspoken blooming between us. At one point, I noticed the way the lamplight softened the lines on his face, making him look almost younger, almost vulnerable. I caught myself studying the curve of his hands, the warmth in his eyes when he laughed. It startled me, this realization that I wasn't just looking at my boss anymore. Hours slipped by unnoticed. When I finally glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. I stood reluctantly, gathering my things, feeling both heavy and light at once. Richard walked me out again, and this time, as we waited for the elevator, I didn't try to fill the silence. The doors opened, and as we stepped inside, I felt his hand brush against mine, so fleeting I might have imagined it. But I didn't pull away. For those few seconds as the elevator descended, our hands remained close enough that the warmth of his skin radiated against mine. It wasn't bold, it wasn't rushed. It was simply there, quiet and steady, like a promise unspoken. When we reached the lobby, he didn't let the moment slip as easily as before. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Margaret," he said, and there was that weight again in my name, that softness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I swallowed, my heart pounding. Yes. He hesitated, then shook his head gently, as though the words he wanted to say weren't ready yet. Instead, he whispered, "Drive safe. Please." It was such a simple thing, but the way he said it, the care in his voice, the almost aching tenderness, stayed with me long after I left. That night, lying awake in bed, I realized something had shifted. Not just between us, but inside me. For the first time in years, I felt the spark of anticipation, of possibility. And though nothing had been spoken outright, I knew it was only the beginning of a path neither of us had planned to walk. The days that followed were strangely charged, though on the surface nothing looked different. Richard still passed by my desk with his usual nod of acknowledgement, still conducted meetings with his calm voice and measured words, and still signed off on reports with his neat, deliberate handwriting. But every glance, every pause, every shared silence seemed heavier, as though something invisible lingered between us, waiting to be named. I caught myself anticipating the end of the workday, not because I wanted to leave, but because I wondered if he would ask me to stay again. When he didn't, I felt both relieved and disappointed, as though my heart wasn't sure what it wanted. But then, one Thursday evening, when most of the floor had emptied out and I was gathering my things, his voice came again, gentle, familiar. "Margaret, would you mind stepping into my office for a few minutes?" I hesitated, my bag slung over my shoulder. "Of course," I said, trying to sound casual, though my pulse had quickened. His office was warm, the golden light from his desk lamp pooling across stacks of papers and the dark wood of his desk. Outside, the city shimmered against the night sky. He motioned for me to sit, and when I did, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that was careful yet unguarded. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about how much time we've both given to this place, about how much of ourselves we've poured into work, sometimes at the expense of, well, living." The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. I folded my hands in my lap. "I know what you mean," I said softly. "There are nights I go home and realize I haven't spoken to anyone outside this office all day. It's a strange kind of loneliness." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "That's just it. We give so much here, but who gives to us? Who really sees us beyond the roles we play?" The silence that followed was thick, but not uncomfortable. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, something that frightened me as much as it drew me in. "I see you," I heard myself say, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My voice was quiet, but steady. Something flickered across his face, relief, maybe, or gratitude. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. "And I see you, Margaret, more than you realize." My breath caught. I looked down, tracing the grain of the wood with my eyes, afraid of what might happen if I held his gaze too long. "I don't know what to do with that," I admitted. "You don't have to do anything," he said gently. "Sometimes it's enough just to acknowledge it." The moment lingered, suspended between us like a fragile thread. Then he stood, moving around the desk to stand closer. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence, close enough that the air seemed to hum with quiet tension. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. I nodded, and together we left the office, descending in the elevator to the lobby. But instead of parting ways at the doors, we stepped out into the cool night air. The city was alive around us, cars rushing by, neon signs glowing against the dark. He led the way down the sidewalk, not saying much, but his pace was slow, deliberate, as though he wanted the night to stretch on. We ended up at a small park a few blocks away, the kind with benches tucked under trees and a fountain that whispered in the dark. It was nearly empty, just a few distant figures and the soft hum of crickets. We sat on a bench side by side, the cool night air brushing against our skin. "I don't usually do this," I admitted, folding my arms against the chill. "Stay out late like this. It feels different." "Good different?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I smiled faintly. "Yes, good different." We sat in silence for a while, watching the ripples in the fountain, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. At some point, I felt his hand resting lightly on the bench near mine. Not touching, not reaching, just there, close enough to remind me of its presence. The quiet stretched, and with it came a strange kind of peace. I found myself speaking softly, almost as if to the night itself. I thought I'd closed that part of my life, the part that feels anticipation, connection. I thought it was behind me. His voice was low, almost a whisper. So did I. I turned to look at him then, really look at him. His face in the lamplight was lined with years, but those lines told stories. Of laughter, of loss, of endurance. There was something steady in his gaze, something that made me feel both safe and seen. "I don't know where this is going," I said honestly, my voice trembling just a little. "You don't have to," he replied. "We don't need all the answers tonight. All we need is to be here, together." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the city drifted around us, muted and distant, as though we were in our own quiet world. Slowly, Carefully, his hand shifted until it touched mine. Not pressing, not demanding, just resting there, warm and steady. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers curl slightly, meeting his touch. The simplicity of it was overwhelming, more powerful than anything grand or dramatic. It was gentle, it was real, and it was ours. We sat like that for a long while, hand in hand, letting the night carry us. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't in years, the stirring of possibility, the promise of a new chapter in a life I'd thought was already written. When he finally walked me back to my car, the air between us was charged but calm, as though we both knew something important had begun. He didn't say goodnight right away. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes steady, his voice soft. "Margaret, thank you for staying." I smiled, my heart full in a way I couldn't explain. "I'm glad I did." That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets, I realized the truth. It wasn't just about staying late in the office anymore. It was about staying open to connection, to possibility, to life itself. And that was something I hadn't expected, but something I was ready for. The weekend after our walk in the park, I found myself thinking about Richard more than I should have. It wasn't like a daydream, not exactly. It was quieter, subtler, like the way a melody stays in your head after a song ends. His words echoed in me, especially the way he'd said, "We don't need all the answers tonight." I kept replaying the warmth of his hand over mine, the steady calm of his presence, the way I hadn't felt alone for the first time in a long time. By Monday morning, I was nervous. Work has a way of making you tuck your emotions into neat boxes, and I wasn't sure if we would slip back into those roles again. Boss and employee, nothing more. But when I arrived, Richard caught my eye from across the office, and though he didn't smile, there was a softness in his gaze that told me the boxes wouldn't hold any more. The day went by in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but late in the afternoon he appeared at my desk. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for me. I nodded, following him into his office. The door clicked softly behind us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of unspoken things hung in the air. "Margaret," he said finally, his tone careful, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about these late nights and conversations." My heart thudded in my chest. I folded my hands, bracing myself. "So have I." He exhaled, leaning against his desk. "I don't want to cross lines or make you uncomfortable, but I can't ignore how much I've come to look forward to those moments. How much I—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "How much I care about them. About you." Hearing it out loud was like standing in sunlight after too long in the shade. My throat tightened, and I had to steady my voice. "You haven't made me uncomfortable, Richard. Not once. If anything, you've reminded me what it feels like to be seen, to matter to someone." His expression softened, and I saw relief flicker across his face. He stepped closer, not hurried, not forceful, just present. "I don't want to rush this," he said. "I don't want to risk what we already have. But if you're willing, I'd like to see where this could go." The simplicity of it unraveled me. All the doubts, all the hesitations, they didn't vanish, but they quieted, replaced by something steady and real. I nodded slowly. "I'd like that too." We stood there for a moment, the hum of the city faint beyond the glass windows, the office around us hushed. He reached out, gently brushing his hand against mine, and this time I didn't hesitate. Our fingers intertwined, and I felt the quiet assurance in his touch. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden sweep into passion. Instead, it was something deeper, a mutual recognition that life still held room for new beginnings, that even at 55, even after years of loss and loneliness, the heart could still surprise us. That evening, he offered to walk me out once more. But instead of heading straight to the parking lot, we stopped by the lobby's wide windows, watching the traffic below. The lights blurred into streams of red and gold, the world rushing on while we stood still. "You know," he said softly, his eyes on the streets below, "I spent so many years thinking my story was finished, that what I had was all there would ever be. But then you stayed late that night, and—" He paused, shaking his head gently. "It reminded me that life has a way of opening doors when you least expect it." His words struck me deeply because they mirrored my own unspoken thoughts. I turned to him, my voice quiet but certain. "Maybe that's what this is, Richard. Not an ending, but a door." He smiled then, not the tired one I'd seen so often, but something brighter, more hopeful. A door worth walking through. We didn't rush into anything more that night. We didn't need to. Instead, we left the building side by side, our steps unhurried, our hands brushing until they finally settled into one another. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about presence, about choosing to walk together when neither of us had expected to. As I drove home, the city lights stretching out before me, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The loneliness that had weighed on me for so long felt lighter, softened by the possibility of connection, of companionship. Not perfect, not certain, but real. And maybe that's what mattered most. When people ask me about that night, when they hear the story of how my boss asked me to stay late in the office, I smile to myself. Because what happened wasn't scandalous or shocking. It was something far rarer. It was two people finding each other in the quiet spaces of life and realizing it's never too late to begin again.